Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries, where we talk about all sorts of imaginary things, books, movies, television shows, anything as long as it has to do with science fiction, fantasy, weird fiction, anything that might be construed in that way. You are joining us two large silverfish who are currently residing behind the giant books of the Gods Library, specifically the section on the life of... I ran out of steam with this joke.
Wrap it up.
That's it. Anyway, I'm joined once again by my lovely co-host, Kendra.
Hi.
And today, we are going to be talking about libraries and librarians in science fiction and fantasy.
I promise this was not my idea, despite being the
It
librarian.
actually wasn't. Yeah. I thought about this because I had just finished Wintertide, which is an awesome book that came out this year by Ruth Anna Emrys. And a lot of that book takes place in two different libraries. So I was like, libraries in science fiction, libraries in fantasy. There are a lot of libraries in both of those genres. Let's talk about why and what they are and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think on a very surface level, my knee-jerk reaction is to assume that libraries feature prominently in sci-fi and fantasy because they are written by people who happen to have a vested interest in libraries, whether for research purposes or childhood nostalgia, or perhaps they are librarians. There are quite a few authors who happen to also have done stints in library service. Yeah, so I happen to think it might be a little bit self-serving in a sense, but there are also some really great and diverse representations. So I'm curious as to where this podcast is going to head.
Yeah, me too. But let's start with what you just said, because I think that you're right. And when I started to think about this, I realized that libraries and characters who are librarians are represented in a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And I think more so in science fiction and fantasy than in literary fiction, as by comparison, which was the first comparison that I jumped to. And I put in our show notes that literary fiction has a lot of protagonists who are struggling writers or disaffected teachers or who live in New York or some combination of all of those, which literary fiction types read and write.
No,
and
please let's stop
stuff.
dividing things into literary versus other fiction, please. Right? Because we've talked about literary, just like the term hard when applied to sci-fi, is just an excuse to describe some fiction as better in a sort of weirdly undefined way.
Yeah, which I am fully behind, since that's what we've come to on this podcast. But when I say literary fiction in this context, I think what I mean is kind of a genre on its own, like... Because when I might just be saying fiction as as a synonym for that, but when I think of fiction, I think of that as including science fiction, fantasy, westerns, historical fiction, romances, literary fiction, like all of that. So I'm trying to point at one particular different genre.
Sure, and at risk of us falling down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out what terms mean again on this podcast, which is a rabbit hole we travel down often. I think it's worth just stating at the outset on this particular podcast, when we talk about genre terms, we're thinking about them mainly in the organizational sense that a bookstore might use to shelve
or a library.
Although we can talk about that later, and I'm waggling my eyebrows massively at you. So, and again, I am a librarian, and I'm coming at this as a skeptic of all representations of librarians and libraries that are not 100% fully accurate. But I also, I grew up on the literature of sci-fi librarians as well. So it'll be interesting to kind of hear how that has collided for you. And I'm going to keep my mouth shut as much as possible.
Well, here's the point that I was going for a minute ago.
Sure.
it seems to me like in science fiction and fantasy, you find libraries and librarians with greater frequency than you do in other genres. And I wonder why that is. Is that because I also want to admit right from the outset that that could just be my bias. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy and fewer books from genres that are not typically categorized as science fiction and fantasy. But
I have a theory.
Yes, please.
Okay.
What is your theory?
My theory is that in genres where world building is a massive chunk of what you dedicate your page space to, you are necessarily going to need to find multiple conduits to unload information in a way that isn't just a simple info dump. Or if it is a simple info dump, makes sense in the architecture of that particular world. And so a convenient way to do that is to have one person who is your arbiter for information, who dispenses information to the other players in this universe in order to make the plot happen without it being interrupted by info dumps that don't make sense. So I think of librarians often in these universes as having unfettered freedom to just vomit words at you and for it to make sense and to feel natural and normal, because anyone who knows librarians knows that that's what we do. We sit there and we discover information and then we disseminate it in volume to the people who need it. So I think librarians serve often very functional roles in sci-fi and fantasy that they don't need to in other universes, because if it's a contemporary fiction piece, unless you have a lot of paranormal stuff happening, as in the Buffy universe, you don't need a librarian. If it's a book that happens in 1984, I don't know, what's a place in America? Indiana?
Sure.
You don't need librarians necessarily to unload information about that world. Because we have a basic understanding of it already. It's close enough in time and space to the average American, reader.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think that that's a good working theory or rather, a good working theory that explains the prevalence of libraries and librarians in science fiction and fantasy. So, let's start there, now that we're a few minutes into the podcast, because a couple of the questions that I want us to wrestle with in this podcast are, if we're viewing libraries and librarians in that context, that really they are repositories of knowledge, agents of knowledge dissemination, how do works that deal with libraries and librarians, how do they subvert that? How do they keep from librarians becoming kind of trite archetypes that are just speaking world dump information? Sorry, those were words that were not correctly put together. But basically, if we're defining librarians in science fiction and fantasy as those characters who hold and pass along knowledge, then how do we subvert that? How do different books subvert that in a way that isn't just dumping information on you with a certain character? Because, and I asked that, so while you're cogitating upon that, I'm thinking let's take something like Harry Potter as an easy example. There is a character who is a librarian in Harry Potter. In the Hogwarts library, you have Madame Pince. Or Pinch, I've always said Pince in my head, so I forget if they pronounce her name in the movies. But
pretty sure not.
I think you could make an equal argument that Dumbledore and Hermione and some of the teachers fulfill the archetype of librarian because they're holding the knowledge and passing it on. So is it fair to say that in science fiction and fantasy, librarians hold knowledge and pass it on? And if so, how do you involve teachers in that, and how do you get away from librarians or just this single function entity in works of science fiction fantasy?
Well, I think we can actually look to common library use today for an answer, in that you have certain questions that you have to take to the information specialists, to the librarian at the reference desk. Perhaps they're for really obscure questions, but it's not typical for someone to walk into a library and immediately go to the librarian for the first like layer of information diving. Usually, most people have a basic understanding of how to operate a library, to go in, browse the shelves, maybe use the computers, and they can do a lot of the information hunting themselves, like Hermione. So on one level, in a sense, everyone can be a librarian in that they can use the library space or the library tools, if it's a digital library, to discover the information that they need. And usually they only turn to us, librarians, when they reach a question that really does exceed their capacity, or that could be answered much more quickly by us than by, spending a couple hours learning how to use this tool. That's going to be a waste of time and may not turn up the answer you want. So when you look at how Hermione and how educators often function in science fiction fantasy, and I'm including Gandalf in this because he goes to a library in Minas Tirith in Lord of the Rings and does some, scroll diving.
Yes.
It seems like it's mostly unassisted scroll diving, like it's self-guided learning in a sense. That is actually, for most librarians, that's like a really beautiful thing to see, is people finding ways to become the librarian. So everyone can be a librarian. Maybe not everyone has it in their job title, but everyone can be a librarian on a certain level, and that's just fine, and that's wonderful. So in some ways, you can have token librarians or functional librarians in text that don't have their primary descriptor as being librarians. And I would even take it a step further and argue that in a lot of television and quite a few movies and sci-fi text today, you don't have libraries or librarians in any recognizable form, but you do have information specialists, where in the text, it's their job to go on a hunt for information, and then they dump it on other people. And in serial television shows, this is more common than anywhere else. So I'm thinking of CSI here, actually, where you have one person who is super cool and really good at hacking. And so their job is to always do the hacking and then release the information uncovered from the hacking to the people who are then going to go and act on it. They usually stay. And this happens in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. too. You have researchers who find out the information, and then you have the people who act on it. And then you start blurring the lines, and then it gets even more interesting. So that is my rant. Congrats.
No, and I think it's easier to do when you are focusing on a character who is maybe a librarian but is more of a main character, and so can expand outward, beyond the singular identity of librarian. And you have other characters, and I think Hermione is a great example from Harry Potter, where she is kind of taking on both the archetype and the identity of librarian, but she's not identified as such.
Sure.
She is not definitionally someone who works in a library, who manages the knowledge that the library contains.
And honestly, the way that J.K. Rowling writes her text saves her from having to use the librarian function all too often. So the world building J.K. Rowling does largely happens, lyrically and effortlessly outside of the library space. It's only very rarely when you have to send a character into the library in order to do library functions. And so that actually makes it, I think, a stronger text. I think it's really interesting how she does her world building, and you have we have quite a few texts, and I would even include Buffy the Vampire Slayer in those texts, where literally for the first season, Rupert Giles is standing there explaining how the world works to everyone for long periods of time. And that can work, especially in a serial television show, when you have to get a lot of random info out of the way so that you can go kick demon butt. But it's just a very different style, and it doesn't feel as effortless. It feels like an older man sitting you down to have a long chat about the way the world works, which in 2017 probably feels pretty different from when the show first aired.
And I think we have to also recognize those librarians who basically fulfill the role of librarian that we would recognize today, like if those librarians walked off the pages of their books. I'm thinking here specifically of Joe Walton's novel, Among Others, which has as its protagonist a young woman who reads voraciously. I think it's set in the 70s. It's definitely set a few decades ago, and she's reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy that's coming out at the time. But there aren't librarians that are necessarily involved deeply in the story any more so than other secondary characters. But the fact that this character, the main character, spends so much time in libraries, peripherally, librarians are always there, and they are the actual purveyors, not of information in the same way that like worlds are built in other works of science fiction and fantasy, but actual books of science fiction and fantasy. So it's this cool like meta commentary on libraries and librarians in sci-fi fantasy.
It's also pretty interesting how the different stereotypes about librarians appeal to different kinds of authors and creators. So Rupert Giles, and I don't quite know about the librarian in the book that you just mentioned because I haven't read it. But Rupert Giles at least fulfills the archetype of this sort of stuffy librarian with the elbow patches and lots of word knowledge. But then you have action hero, sexy librarians like Evelyn Carnahan from The Mummy, who pretty much revolutionized how people view librarians for a while. And then you have the information specialist, the kind of nerdy, serious librarian that's younger, like you have Barbara Gordon, who's also Oracle, and Batgirl in the Batman TV show. And she shows the evolution of librarian in a really interesting way. Like a lot of the different perspectives on librarians and stereotypes about librarians you have a chance to play out over the course of the many series Batman TV show. So what would you say is the stereotype, or is there a stereotype that maybe has exploded out a little bit in that book?
Well, if I'm going to talk about exploding librarian stereotypes, I'm actually going to leave Among Others where it is, because it does not necessarily play upon those stereotypes directly, but I want to talk about Garth Nix's Old Kingdom books, specifically the character Lyriel and the book in which she first appears, which is also Lyriel. But Lyriel is a librarian. You see a large part of what's a fairly large book devoted to her life as a librarian, her goals as a librarian, her daily tasks as a librarian, the way that the Library of the Clare, which is the people that she's a part of, what it contains. And it contains everything from old scrolls and old books to dangerous magical creatures that are sealed far, far below the surface levels. And it's a really exciting and adventurous take on both libraries and librarians. The phrase armed parties of librarians occurs at least once in the book, which is cool. So, I'm right there with you regarding Evelyn, what's her last name?
Carnahan, at least that's her original last name, because she marries Mr. O'Connell, I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Evelyn from The Mummy. And Lyriel and some of the comic characters you mentioned are, importantly, I think, subverting what we think of as librarians. And I want to mention, too, that all of the characters we just mentioned are female. And that's a big thing, because
Rupert
I think
Giles.
that... Oh, right. Well, everyone except Rupert. But they're subverting kind of this demure, sexless, uninteresting, single-dimensional stereotype of librarians as just, the kind of mousy women with thick glasses who are there to provide information and not say anything else to whatever the character happens to be. It's easy to build multiple archetypes of librarian, but I think that some of those characters in particular are answering back to a particular 1950s brand of subservient femininity. In particular,
it's really interesting to me that you go from saying sexless to subservient femininity. I'm kind of curious about that a little bit more, I guess, because I identify as agender on top of being asexual and aromantic. You know, for me, to be sexless is not automatically a negative thing to apply.
Right.
So I guess I'm curious how you would unpack that and I think you were kind of headed there by transforming sexless into subservient femininity.
Yes. Yeah. So, sexless, when I was mentioning it, and I even said, I was about to say, like, asexual, but then I was like, that's not a bad thing, and I tried to. Anyway, so what I was thinking was lack of agency, specifically. Okay. Like, lack of sexual agency, lack of emotional agency, lack of any agency. Right.
Where, in reality, to be asexual or agendered or, quite a few of these letters that are further down the LGBTQIA plus, spectrum, it's actually, it requires a significant amount of agency to impose your existence, as you obviously are very well aware, to impose your existence on the universe. I'm here, I'm real, I exist, I'm valid. That kind of sequence of phrases, it's harder to say than you might think, but I'm saying you, but I mean,
a general
you. So let's get back to the list of characters that we drew up. Because there's one on this list that we haven't talked about in our show notes that, I'm going to admit it, I watched The Legend of Korra first. And then I tried watching The Last Airbender and I couldn't get into it. And that makes me pretty unusual, I think, in the Last Airbender continuum of fans. But okay, so I'm not familiar with Wan Shitong. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Wan Shitong, who is the curator and librarian of the Great Library, who we spend a couple of episodes building up to kind of tangentially in Last Airbender, and then spend some time with, and then revisit briefly in Korra. But I always liked the depiction of Wan Shitong, who I should say is a spirit. The Great Library is kind of a bridge between the human and spirit worlds in the Avatar world. But there are very clear rules to how the library works. In order to peruse the library, at least for our characters in The Last Airbender, they have to provide some sort of specialized knowledge to the library that the library doesn't already possess. So there's kind of a bartering system going on, knowledge for knowledge. So it's kind of, again, going back to that idea of there is a librarian, but within the library, or in the context of the library, characters also become librarians in that they are... they have knowledge, they distribute knowledge, they barter knowledge in this case. And I just like it because Wan Shitong is kind of a giant fucking owl, which, like, perfect librarian, I think.
Well, I mean, especially if you ascribe to the notion that librarians probably have interesting eyesight problems from squinting at books all the time, which is not wrong. Although these days, most of the small type that librarians are squinting at happens to be on computer screens. It's a little bit of a different universe. But I can see, and also the staying up late thing. But that's because there's so many good books in the world and you can't get through them all on time. And it's just really frustrating. Because you don't actually read at work. Fun fact, librarians don't have time to read at work. Like 99% of librarians anyway. Okay, so another character that I am not altogether familiar with because I haven't... I've only read one Terry Pratchett book. Let's talk about the librarian in Discworld. Or you talk about the librarian in Discworld since I have only read the one book.
Well, I will admit straight away that it's been years since I've read any Discworld books, so I'm kind of going on memory here because I didn't look this up before the podcast. But I remember the librarian in Discworld standing out as an absurd trickster in a world of characters who are already campy and over the top and in their hilarity and the way that they negotiate the world. So I also remember that the librarian was maybe an orangutan. Maybe I forget. I honestly forget. But that the idea of the librarian in Discworld stuck with me as adding to that rich stew of possibilities for librarian characters as a trickster, which is not necessarily a role or an archetype that I would associate with the librarian, I would say that the librarian is kind of its own archetype and has more to do with... Now I'm getting into, like, Jungian archetypes, because I was going to say, like, the wise old man or the wise old woman. And really what I want to say is, in a lot of science fiction and fantasy, the librarian is established as an archetypal giver of information, like we talked about. But the librarian from Discworld turns that idea on its head and is, again, based on what I remember, helpful in the right circumstances, but also can be a hindrance in the wrong circumstances. It is a little bit like Wan Shi Tong, actually, in that way, because the characters in Avatar do end up fighting with Wan Shi Tong, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'm curious to explore this notion of the library as a bridge between worlds a little bit more.
Yes.
You mentioned that with Wan Shi Tong, especially, and it occurs now that I think about it, in The Library at Mount Char, which is a book by Scott Hawkins, and it also occurs in I'm assuming the book series, although I haven't read it, but also the television series based on the books, The Magicians, which the books were written by Lev Grossman, and then the series is now running on the Sci-Fi Channel, which is actually a rather dark take on kind of the Narnia series, in a sense, again. And Narnia, too, has, like, the wood between the worlds. It doesn't have a library between the worlds, but in the Magicians series, the library occupies the space of the wood between the worlds, in that you can kind of get from one world to another by passing through this middle ground, which is the library. And the library at Mount Char, similarly, you have some dimensional hijinks happening there, where you pass from one dimension or space into the library, and then from there you can portal out to other places. It's really interesting. So in the libraries and with the librarians that you added to our show notes, are there any elements of this bridging, and can we maybe unpack a little bit of why we use the library instead of some other space for
Absolutely.
this?
Yeah. And I'm gonna take that in a wholly different direction and enter into our evidence, The Handmaid's Tale, as in which the library functions as a bridge between worlds. Not in the way that we're thinking about it as, you have the human world and the spirit world, or, two separate worlds, a world of magic and a world without, like in The Magicians, but rather a bridge between the world that Offred occupies in the future of The Handmaid's Tale and the world that she used to occupy. I don't think it's any accident. I mean, of course it's not an accident, because Margaret Atwood is brilliant, but the fact that the room in which her Scrabble games take place with the commander, the room where she finds out what the Latin phrase in her closet means, etc., the room in which the commander keeps books, keeps magazines for her to look at, is... I honestly cannot remember if it's described as the library of the house in the book, but it functions as a library in that it's where you keep information. It might be the den, but I think of it as a library, both in the television series and when I'm remembering the book. And I think that that's important because that is a different kind of a bridge, but a bridge nonetheless.
Yeah.
In how it functions in the book, and how it functions for Offred, the character.
And how books, for her, despite the non-fantastical sci-fi context, the books and the magazines, because there are quite a few magazines that he shares with her too, are worlds in and of themselves. They open up possibilities, imaginative possibilities for her that didn't exist before she had access to them. And I think perhaps that's another tie back to our initial, my initial speculations, that a lot of the reasons why we have so many libraries in sci-fi and fantasy is that there's a childhood nostalgia factor. Because when you, as a child, stumble across libraries for the first time, you're not just stumbling across a bunch of data resources. You're stumbling across imaginative possibilities, and your world opens once you enter a library. And when I look at the families that use the library and the families that don't, especially when you look at maybe insular communities like homeschoolers, those who come to the library, you just see like so much more happening be outside of the boundaries of their schoolwork. You know, homeschooling parents in general will deliver at least enough for the kids to get their schoolwork done. But when they bring the kids to the library, suddenly you have kids also sneaking in a book for pleasure or asking you some questions about this or that thing that they read. And it's just, I love it. I mean, this is what I live for. And this is why working as a youth services librarian is not at all a hardship for me. Because I see minds in the process of completely exploding. And that is so cool. And that's also something that I think we want to recapture as we get older, the feeling of wonder as we feel ourselves entering a new epoch of self-evolution. That's my little tie back right there.
Yeah, and I love that. And I wonder, you know, because you have the unique perspective that is your perspective, you know, as a youth services librarian, you get to actually see kids coming into the library in all the various capacities that they do so, including reading for pleasure. And I'm remembering, you know, when I was a kid, the librarians who had a big impact on me, who helped me find books, who, like, you know, remarked on the books that I was checking out, who talked to me, who I could talk to as, like, you know, people who were familiar with the books that I was reading. And that was so important in my development as a reader. And I don't mean to, you know, put the librarians on a pedestal above, like, my parents or teachers or anyone else, but I will put you on a pedestal. Right. But, like, the importance of librarians to my development, you know, into me now at 30, when, you know, and I'm still reading, like, books like crazy, like, I can't undersell that importance. And I wonder if part of the reason why science fiction and fantasy has so many librarians and libraries in it is that, you know, so many kids who grew up to be writers of science fiction and fantasy had similar you know, experiences when they were kids, where libraries and librarians really exposed them to and allowed them to explore all these different imaginary worlds that they wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise.
I mean, I don't know that we'll get an answer to that question unless we directly poll Patrick Rothfuss, but my guess is that the answer would be probably an unequivocal yes. I don't know of a lot of specifically fantasy writers, or like the fantastical end of the sci-fi spectrum. I don't know of a lot of fantastical writers who I follow on Twitter who haven't at some point or another, you know, really advocated for going to your local public library. And even James S.A. Corey, the two authors who make up James S.A. Corey, on that Twitter account, you see regular pointers back to the library, even though libraries don't have like a direct quantifiable impact on sales figures for a book. You know, in some ways they increase sales and in some ways they decrease sales, you know, because obviously if you borrow a book from a library, you're not going to buy it probably. But if you borrow a book from a library, very often you're going to recommend it to your friends, and some of those friends are likely to buy it. And there are other kind of indirect effects there. So, you know, it's a complicated relationship between commercial authors or authors who depend upon book sales and libraries. But most of the ones that I see are still like pointing people back to it. And why would they point people back to the library unless they had some emotional connection to it themselves, you know?
Right.
I think that it's probably a safe bet that most authors in that end have spent quality time in a library, whether doing self-guided research, or maybe they were brought in as kids to programs like the ones that I run, or you know, maybe the first time they were able to lay hands on coding or you know, circuitry or programming and all of these wonderful things was in a library makerspace. You know, there's so many different ways that the library can boost interest in sci-fi-ish concepts.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and so here's a segue. Let me show you my segue. So when I was a kid, I went to, and my family lived in Tucson for a couple of years, where I currently live. my family went to the library branch that I now use as a grown-up. And my memory of what that library looked like in, like, the early to mid-90s is completely different from what the library looks like now. And it's not just, you know, like, I grew up and it looks totally different. Like, it was completely renovated. Yeah. But what I remember from when I was a kid is that it was a library full of books. You had stacks upon stacks upon stacks of books, and, you know, you had the adult sections, which were a little more austere, and you had the children's sections, which had some toys, and the shelves were lower, etc., etc. Now, a lot of the library space is computers, and there are a lot fewer books there. And I this isn't going to turn into, like, a rant about, like, libraries should have more books. Like, that's not where I'm going with this.
I can give you a concise sort of description of the different directions that libraries have headed, if it's ever of interest to you.
Yes, absolutely. And we may actually engage you on that.
Engaging proton torpedoes.
Yes. Well, since we're in Star Trek mode now, here is my supposition. Okay. A lot of the examples that we've talked about so far, whether because they're set in alternate worlds, or they involve magic, or they're set in various pasts, are further towards the fantasy end of the science fiction fantasy spectrum, train, however you want to say it. If you look at, especially future science fiction, there are fewer libraries. And maybe that means that we need to be more capacious with our understanding of what a library is. And as I was thinking of this, what I put in the show notes is, you know, what is a library in a sense that captures the entirety of science fiction and fantasy and what can exist? Can something like the computer on the Enterprise in either the original series or Next Generation, or really any of the Star Trek series, because it has so much information, because it can give you that information, because in the holodeck it can display stories and you can actually act out the stories. Is the computer itself, does the entire ship, does everything become a potential library at the drop of a hat?
Yes, well, maybe not. I mean, okay, so my sort of central figure of interest when I listen to you talking that way, that's a very convoluted way of saying, what you remind me of is in Galaxy Quest. And you'll be able to tell me the Star Trek original inspiration for this. But, Sigourney Weaver's character in Galaxy Quest, her role as liaison to the computer is essentially the same thing as librarian in a lot of more fantastical settings, in that she is tasked with interpreting the data that the computer gives you and disseminating it to the right people, or giving the computer commands to execute. And I would suspect that in most futuristic sci-fi universes where information databases are more or less entirely stored digitally, you're going to have characters like that. And I think also of Battlestar Galactica, you have a rotating cast of characters who move through the the battle hub area, who interpret the data on the screen for the audience. And honestly, librarians in sci-fi are there just as much for the reader to access the world as they are for the characters and the plot to happen. So I think, and Battlestar Galactica is a great example too, because that is very clearly a nostalgia-heavy sci-fi world, in that it's looking back as much as it is looking forward and looking at the present day. So you have characters actually loaning physical books to each other, as well as having these digital information hubs that are central to the function of the story, and these characters who interpret that data for the purpose of story. So, I think that the answer is yes, and possibly no in certain circumstances, but mostly yes. If that makes sense.
Well, speaking of interpreting data, can we interpret data from the Next Generation? Because I think,
the person?
Data the person, yes.
Okay.
We could call Data a librarian, or we could call Data a library. And I think we could probably call him both with some, and not be wrong about that.
I mean, are we going to call him both, or are we going to call him both?
Both.
Both? With an L?
Both. With
okay.
both. Both.
Both. With a B-O-E. Okay, so Data, the character, I think you could definitely make an argument for him being an information repository, but an information repository that is self-explicating. So he'd be completely useless if he wasn't able to access his own data and interpret it for others, you know?
Right.
And that's essentially what humans are.
Absolutely.
So are humans all computers,
Yes.
and are humans all libraries too? Yes.
Yes. How far do we go down the hole?
Uncomfortably far.
Uncomfortably far. I'm a library. I am a library.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's, you could maybe, well, let's take a couple steps back there.
Yeah,
but like,
I mean, I would say we can all be information scientists, and actually that is the direction that library science degrees are headed, is towards being information scientists. More so than being, attached to the physical space. So you asked about, or you mentioned at least, that libraries today look different from libraries then, or at least your specific library does. And I can tell you quickly and simply that libraries are in the midst of convulsions over what they want to be for the future. You have libraries like the Brighton Library in, I think it's Northeast Denver, where one of their branches, the Brighton branch, has just gotten rid of books altogether, and it's primarily a civic public space. And it can get away with this because it's part of a branch network, so other branches in the network still have physical books if people want them, but they have an art gallery area where adults can come in and mess around and make art, and then they've got a maker space, which is a dedicated area for the kids to come in, and then they have computer space and instructional space and civic meeting space. And honestly, I have a great deal of sympathy for people who think that libraries should head in that direction. Do I think that most libraries are going to get rid of books? Probably not. But I can tell you, as a librarian, the primary demand in our library is not for more books, it's for the most current books and for more room to run programs. So libraries are currently packed with more books than people could ever read. But people don't read the majority of the books that are in libraries. And if they want the latest, greatest thing, usually they go to Costco and buy it or whatever. And so most people are actually coming to the library either because they're low income and low resource, and they're actually using the space just as much for job applications and the legal help. We have a self-help law center, things like that. And for printing, things like that, instead of coming in for the books. I'd say it's probably 50-50 in our library. Yeah. And then, the biggest thing of the year is the summer reading program, which there's a lot of people coming into the library for books, but only so that they can get their rewards. And then there's even more people coming in for the programs where I read to the kids, where we have speakers and presenters and crafts. And when we did the Eclipse party, it was packing out not just the library, but the entire block outside the library. We had 1,200 people show up in rural Montana. I mean, people come to the library because we can provide them with resources, and those resources are increasingly not books. And we have a librarian, and we have a full-time staff of 7, I think. But one of our staff is a full-time tech services librarian, and her job is 50-50, doing one-on-one trainings with people and then teaching classes and doing senior outreach. So, most of our day is not spent in books or answering information queries. It's teaching, it's being an educator or being an entertainer, in my case, which is the best job of all. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the short and simple answer, I guess, to your question. So some libraries are physically changing the space to reflect that. Most libraries have made some concessions to the changes, even if they haven't really committed to getting rid of their books. And that's just fine, wherever you fall on the spectrum. And as long as you're in an urban area where there's other libraries to pick up the slack, depending on what you give up, you're probably okay. Now, in a rural environment, you have less slack. You have to be everything to everyone, and so the stakes are maybe a little higher for the individual. But yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, and not one that's going to be resolved soon.
Yeah, right, right. Well, actually, I think that's a fantastic place to head for our wrap up because, a lot of what we've talked about are those libraries that are set in fantasy worlds or in fantastical pasts or what have you. But going into futuristic science fiction and futuristic fantasy, thinking about what roles libraries play in the present and projecting into the future, that's really interesting to see how their roles could potentially change in science fiction and fantasy.
And I think they will change symbolically. I think you'll see the books being written now, today in 2017, that will be released in the next 5 or so years, they might show, I'm really hoping they show, libraries as a center for resistance or as a feeding ground for resistance and revolution and social change. Because, taking it back to your example in The Handmaid's Tale, libraries have great potential to reveal us for what we are. I mean, even if you're just looking at the physical books, if you read a couple of books in the library, you're going to see a couple different perspectives on humans and how we work or don't work.
Right.
And you have some amazing texts and resources and partnerships developing in libraries today, which could see that happen in real life, like the partnerships between the American Library Association and the American Civil Liberties Union and various other things like that. So you're seeing libraries become these partners in civic action and education. They're also becoming rallying points during times of disaster and tragedy. In some of these places where you've had conflict between police and protesters, you'll see the libraries step up and use their disaster preparedness plans to serve the public, to provide rallying points for people looking for their loved ones, or to provide water and snacks and food and medical care for people who are injured in the streets. So physically, I think that's a cool thing. It's also, I think, going to impact the literature that's released in 5 or 10 years. If people are paying attention to what libraries are doing today, you might see more Handmaid's Tale-ish takes on the function of libraries, where libraries inform and expand characters, and librarians inform or expand characters' capacity to act in times of trouble, So I'm curious. That would be my speculation. But what about you? I mean, I'm speaking as a librarian, but I'm obviously caught up in, the library world. From an outside perspective, what do you see happening? And am I off base?
No, I think you're right on, and I love that. And I think that that's actually possibly the strongest thing we could end with, the future of libraries and the fact that the revolution will be library approved. You can check out a revolution at your local library, and I don't mean to make it into something trite, because I think what you just said is incredibly powerful, and this evolving role that libraries will have is really cool. But also the fact that libraries have housed books that have been banned and debated and burned in the past, the fact that libraries have always sort of had that capacity, and now as they're changing, they still have that role, but maybe it's via space and access and action more so than holding space. Maybe it's more like giving space and allowing space rather than holding space. And I think that's a really interesting supposition, and I will, as you say, love to see how that's borne out in the science fiction and fantasy of the next decade. Or
I mean, a quick word of warning though, as libraries continue to move into this resistance space, libraries and librarians and the people who write them into their texts need to also be aware that libraries and librarians are gatekeepers. And by being a gatekeeper, you are necessarily shaping what other people see as possible. And that can become really dangerous if you gatekeep certain texts out of your library. So the conversation about censorship needs to happen hand in hand with the writing of libraries into science fiction. And I think, honestly, a lot of libraries have been romanticized in science fiction and fantasy without examining this censorship function that libraries do serve, just by where you spend your bucks on what items you collect, what databases you subscribe to and allow your patrons to access, that censors. So if you have a budget cut like we have this year, we have a major budget cut, you have less money to spend and you're deciding which categories of books you're going to buy. Are you going to buy the ones that are read and are popular? Or are you going to buy the ones that are diverse and represent diverse authorship? Are you going to buy the ones that maybe push people's ideas a little bit more or are controversial in nature? And I'm thinking, like, it is a little bit of a battle. All of our library staff, spoiler alert, is white. And getting a book by, say, Ta-Nehisi Coates or Nnedi Okorafor or N.K. Jemisin or a lot of authors of color and resistance authors, getting them into our library is hard. And I'm having to make a concerted effort to educate myself on what's out there and make sure it gets into the library, that we spend our precious bucks on it. Because it is important. Yeah. And if you neglect to present librarians as limited in your sci-fi or fictional text, you're not representing us as we are, which is frail and, incomplete and sometimes completely incapable of doing what we ought to be doing. So, I would love to see some less romanticized depictions of librarians, because all of the librarians we've talked about have been positive, for the most part, incarnations. So, play around with that a little bit, authors.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my final thought.
Cool. Well, I think that is a great final thought. So maybe you can tell our lovely listeners where to find us.
Okay, well, first things first, I would love to point you to our continually evolving and now actually decent-looking website, which is www.imaginaries.net, where we are keeping past podcasts listed there. We're also expanding. We have kind of semi-little snarky reviews of the authors we love, and we're adding to that list as we go. So if you have suggestions, please let us know. You can also find us on Twitter. We are at imaginary_pod. We also have our individual Twitter accounts, which you can access from there. We're on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, pretty much any podcast app that you use, we use. We are also, again, open to suggestion if you have suggestions for improvement on that score for access. And please at us anytime you like. We do respond to every tweet. So, please, unless you're a troll. If you're a troll, that's up in the air. Maybe I'll respond, maybe I won't. But give us an comment on our website or email us. Do you want to take us out? Any final thoughts?
Go to your local library. Check out some books. Check out some space. See what's going on. I need to go to the library and pick up like 5 books tomorrow. So
very, very cool. Well, thank you so much for another fantastic podcast, Tony.
Thank you, librarian.
Woot.